Well, it's great to see everybody here. There's a lot of familiar faces, and it's just exciting to get together to hear Phil Gardner today. Unfortunately, Christine Reeves gave us was unable to make it, and we didn't know that until yesterday. So it's just Phil, but we're really excited to have Phil. And this is the fourth of a series of town halls that we've had. We've had town halls with candidates for LD22 and for county commissioner, and I think they've been very informative. And so we're starting a series now with CD10 candidates. And today we have Phil Gardner. Next week we'll be having Marilyn Strickland and Beth Dolio. So stay tuned for that. And then we probably will have another, well, we're anticipating having a town hall with Lori Dolan and Sam Hunt after that, the following week. There's a few ground rules here, I guess. We're going to have Phil give us about a 10-minute speech about himself, let us know about his candidacy. And then we'll go after that to 30 minutes, or if you're available, perhaps longer, because now we don't have the time restriction. And we do have
all the time in the world, John.
We have a lot of questions already. And but you can submit a question using the chat, which is at the bottom of the screen, and that'll go to our host, and he'll forward those to me. Let's see. The only other thing is just want to remind everybody that the endorsement team, who several of our members back, I think all of our members are on board today. We'll be conducting an all-member meeting. We don't have the finalized date, but it'll probably be about mid-June. And then we will conduct a week of voting with ranked choice voting to select our endorsements for CD10, LD22, county commissioner, and the Superior Court judge position 8. I think that is all of them. Let's see. So I think that's about it. So I'm ready to turn it over to Phil and let him let us know about Phil Gardner.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for participating today and for organizing these. I think one of the unfortunate problems of the pandemic, low in the grand scheme of the pandemic, but the inability for us to gather in person and have forums like this for all the local offices that are up on the ballot is unfortunate. So I'm really glad that individual chapters and Legal Women Voter chapters and others are stepping up to organize this. So thank you for that. So my name's Phil Gardner. I have called the 10th Congressional District home my entire life. I recognize a lot of familiar faces on this call from my work that has consumed most of the last part of the last 10 years of my life, which is working as a top staffer for our retiring Congressman Denny Heck. I served for 2 years as his communications director back in Washington, D.C., and for the last 3 years have worked as his district director in his district office here in Lakewood and Lacey. I left that position in January in order to run for this. But working alongside Denny in different capacities over the last 10 years, serving our district has really been the honor of a lifetime for me. Because as I said, the 10th Congressional District has always been home for me. I grew up in Puyallup, attending Puyallup Public Schools, graduated from high school in University Place, have lived and worked down in Olympia and Thurston County during my time working for Congressman Heck, and I'm currently a homeowner in McKinley neighborhood in the part of Pierce County that is in the 10th Congressional District. I decided to get into this race really for 3 reasons. The first was that I really feel like right now our country is at a crossroads moment where we are going to decide who our government is going to work for and what our government is going to use its power to do. And right now our government isn't working for most people. It's definitely not working for young people, but it's generally not working for most people. And instead of using power of government to solve big problems, the people in charge in DC and the White House and in the Justice Department and throughout our federal agencies, they're using their power to line their own pockets and cover up their crimes and separate children from their families and create a planet that's uninhabitable for future generations. And that was all before they bungled the biggest public health crisis of any of our lifetimes. I really feel like they have stolen our government and that they are stealing our future. And I feel like the stakes are so high that we need to acknowledge them, and then we need to intentionally work within that framework to take them back. We need to take back our government, and we need to take back our future. And I think that the way that we do that is the way that we've done that throughout our country's history, after Watergate, after World War II, after the Kennedy assassination, which is that we send some young people with experience and know-how and a record of service back to DC to change the culture a bit. I don't think everybody in Congress needs to be a young person, but I think there should be a lot more young people than there are right now. If elected, I would be the first member of the US House or Senate born in the 1990s. There were over 40 million Americans who were born in the 1990s. All of us are voting age. None of us are in Congress. If we're going to truly have a representative democracy that's going to think about our future and the interests of everybody, I think we need more young people back there. We need people there. Eventually there will be people there born in the 90s. I'd like for us to get there before we aren't able to solve some of these problems like the climate crisis and the ongoing COVID pandemic. I'd also be Washington State's first openly LGBTQ member. I think that representation is important, and to that effect, I've been endorsed by Equality PAC, which is the political arm of the Congressional LGBT Equality Caucus. So the 7 members of the House who are the 7 LGBT members of the House who are already serving there have endorsed my candidacy because they really believe that we need some change back there, that we need some young blood. So that's the first big reason I got in. The second is because I really feel like this district is more complicated than it looks. I think Congressman Heck, who's been the only member representing it for the last 8 years, has made holding on to it look easy. But the truth is that the Pierce County portion of this district is quite different in some ways from the Thurston portion of this district. It has a much heavier military presence. There are parts of Thurston County that certainly have a base presence, but it also has a much more diverse, multicultural element to it within the central area. And holding on to this seat in a tough year for Democrats, I think, is a lot harder than it looks. It's a D+5 seats. It's teetering on the edge of being a swing district. And we need someone who's able to win over those Pierce County swing voters in good years and bad years. And that's who raised me, those Pierce County swing voters. That's where I come from, Puyallup, University Place, Lakewood. I know this area. I've knocked on over 10,000 doors in this district for various candidates. There's no one in this race or really anywhere except for perhaps Denny who has a better feel of this district itself. And that's the third big reason why I got in this race. There are sort of 4 major Democratic candidates in this race, and I'm one of them. 2 of them don't live in this district. And I think that matters a lot. I think it's more than a technicality. I think it says something about priorities. I think it's wrong that you would ask someone for their vote when you yourself can't vote in that election. I fundamentally don't really understand that. And I think it makes the stakes different. And I think that the people in this district deserve someone who is always going to put them as their first priority, and for whom representing them isn't their second choice because they couldn't get a backup option. And when I saw that there was going to be no viable Democrat from Pierce County who actually lived in the Pierce County portion of the 10th, I felt that was wrong. And I felt I had something to offer, and so I wanted to offer myself up. So I look forward to the questions, and I don't want to ramble on too much here, but I know that this is a tough choice for a lot of people. I know that there's several candidates that lots of people are fond of, but what I think I can offer is both a really deep familiarity and intimacy with this district, a representation that continues the parts about Denny's work that so many people like, but also that fresh perspective of a younger generation back in DC. There are very few districts in the country have the opportunity to send someone in their 20s to Congress and really make a splash back in DC. We're one of them. And I think that, I know I've been told my whole life that, we need young people to step up. We need young people to get more involved in politics. And I think that this is the moment to do it. I think this is a moment where our district can say, we really want someone back in DC who's thinking about the long term, who's thinking about everyone. And that's why I'm offering myself up. The last point I'll make is that I first started meeting with Olympia Indivisible back in, I believe it was in January of 2017. First, right when Indivisible started getting going, the Olympia chapter got started. And some of the other offices from our state, the delegation, they sort of approached Indivisible with almost an attitude of fear or worry that sort of, who are these people and why do we want to meet with them? And I just have never really understood that perspective. What I've always found with Olympia Indivisible and why I've tried to meet with delegation every month as much as you all want is because I think that you are the backbone that's going to keep our democracy together right now. I think in a lot of ways you're much better organized and more effective than even the local political parties here, which is pretty remarkable because you're all still new at this and just forming together. But I think it's a very valuable partnership and asset that our civic discourse really needs. And so that's why I've been so engaged with both Olympia Indivisible and Indivisible Tacoma. And that's something that I would want to continue as a member, because I think that if we're going to keep our democracy going, if we're going to solve these big problems, we need everybody off the sidelines. We need everybody involved. And I think that's what Olympia Indivisible has done for so many people that I've had the chance to work with. So again, I appreciate all your time and look forward to the conversation.
Well, all right. That's thank you very much. And yeah, I think speaking on behalf of Olympia Indivisible, I'd like to say thank you for the open door to you and Denny Heck for the open door policy you've had. So I know our MOC team has had a great relationship with your office. So let's go to the first question. So you're closely identified with Denny Heck, as you've explained just now. You've had a long association with him. In terms of policy, how do you see yourself in step with Denny? How do you see yourself perhaps moving away from Denny? Or how would you distinguish yourself from Denny?
Sure. Yeah, great question. And there's two bits. The first is that while most of my work has been with Denny, I think that's the most relevant work for this particular job that I'm seeking. I have also worked for a lot of other different candidates around the South Sound, many of whom have endorsed my campaigns. People like Jessica Bateman, the Olympia Mayor Pro Tem, Pat McCarthy, our current state auditor, who used to be the Pierce County executive, Victoria Woodards, who is supporting Maryland, but I was a big part of her campaign, and we'll all be friends in the end, probably. But I think that in terms of my work with Denny and how that has shaped me and how I want to build on that, I think the best way to look at it is specifically with healthcare. The last 10 years of federal politics have really been one ongoing debate and fight over healthcare. Starting with the passage of the Affordable Care Act way back in 2010, and then the Tea Party backlash, and the attempts by the Obama administration to implement it, and now the attempts by the Trump administration to take it all apart again. And one of the things that I've been really proud to do alongside Denny is to defend the gains that the Affordable Care Act made in the face of ongoing sabotage efforts by Tea Party Republicans and the current administration. I was there in the Capitol when the government shut down in 2013, when Ted Cruz wanted to try to repeal Obamacare. I worked with Denny to organize the largest pro-ACA rally in Pierce County back in the spring of 2017 that a lot of Indivisible Tacoma members were at it well. As a patient with 2 pre-existing conditions who relies on 5 prescription medications a day, I really understand the cost of prescription drugs and the importance of that. And I've also worked as an EMT in our nation's capital and have seen our broken healthcare system up close. And what all those experiences have taught me, especially with Denny on healthcare policy, is that we've made a lot of progress, but now we need to take it to the next level. And if you go on my website, I have a very detailed healthcare stance, but one of the things that I think Denny has almost become sort of notorious for is sort of a firm rejection of the Medicare for All position under any circumstance. And that's not something I agree with. I think Medicare for All is something that is doable. It happens in countries all over the planet, including just to our north. I think that single payer systems, when we look at them from a theoretical standpoint, are obviously the most efficient. The catch is that we need to figure out a way to transition from our current system into a system like that in a way that doesn't negatively affect people or cause a backlash that then sort of upends a lot of the other progress that we've made. So I would support first of all, I think the most urgent things that I hear in terms of healthcare policy are, again, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, trying to end surprise medical billing, reducing out-of-pocket expenses like copays and deductibles. I think as we can make incremental progress on those are things that I would support. And I think that sort of comes out of the same philosophy that Denny's done. But I also think that now, especially in the light of the pandemic, we're at a place where we need to be thinking bigger. And I think that we need to consider our full spectrum of options in terms of what our healthcare delivery system is going to look like, what our health insurance system is going to look like. Again, on my website, I lay out sort of 5 specific things that I would want to see in a Medicare for All bill before I would support it, including making sure that our union brothers and sisters are made whole in terms of any bargaining capacity that they've won in healthcare gains, making good in terms of wages, making sure our rural hospitals can stay afloat, and making sure those reimbursement rates cover them. And also, making sure that middle-class families and working-class families aren't ended up paying more, whether it's in taxes or in premiums. But I think that is the direction that the whole Democratic Party is going. I think that's the direction that the country needs to go, which is that we made a lot of progress over the last 10 years under President Obama. I think we've seen the damage that can be done when that progress is threatened. And now we need leaders back there who are going to both defend that progress and take the next steps. And I think I'm uniquely positioned to have that youthful perspective to understand what is possible sort of in a big picture sense, but also to have that hands-on experience of how real policies get made and how defense happens, or how we need to defend things. And I can talk about other issues, on climate, on various things that are also like that. But I think the metaphor that I found, and I won't say this around Denny, is think about getting an upgraded phone. You keep all the same features, but you get some new ones too. And that's what I'm offering. And I think the more people hear about it and remember what they liked about Denny and the work he did, especially in the Russia investigation, I think that's going to shine through. So that's my basic pitch there. But I respect and consider Denny a friend and mentor. But I'm also my own person.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question is, you have the lowest level of campaign contributions compared to your major competitors. How will you make up for that deficit in your campaign?
I had noticed that. Thank you for pointing that out, John. I'm just kidding. Yeah, so I mean, again, I'll be real honest with you folks. I'm a 28-year-old. I don't have as large of a professional network as the other 3 major Democratic candidates in this race. My premise when I got in this race was that as I got out there and met more people and built up support and meet and greeted and had events, that our campaign would build momentum and build a buzz. And I think in January and February, that was really happening. We had a great event in late February with 80 people up in Tacoma at our brewery. About 40 of them were young people, some of them making their first political contributions ever. Pierce County political events are quite hard to do. It's rare you get 80 for anything. So I felt really good. And then of course, March happened and all of our lives changed and my life changed too. And now I'm campaigning here from my condo. So it's just a tougher road to hoe. And I never anticipated that I would be the top fundraiser in this race. My goal has always just been to be able to get my message out. And in terms of what we've been able to do since the pandemic started and we've had to shift to this digital landscape, one of the endorsements that I already referenced from Equality PAC, which is the political arm of the LGBT Equality Caucus, I've been able to see a lot of great support in the last few weeks coming in through more national donor networks who are eager to support LGBT endorsed candidates. I'm also continuing to reach out to folks who have shown a tendency to support younger candidates, sort of candidates who may be able to shake things up. So I am doing 30, 40 hours of call time a week because basically all we can do here is Zoom things and make calls and call voters as well. But I am confident that I'm going to have the resources to get my message out and to deliver that. And I'm going to keep going at that. But if anybody would like to help me get there, it's philgardner.com, and anything you're able to chip in would go a long way. We're grassroots funded. I don't take corporate PAC money, and I've signed the no fossil fuel pledge. So
good. Okay. You've never held elective office before. How will you make up for the lack of experience? How will this not be an impediment to raising support? Of course, that kind of dovetails with the last question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I would say that, I think the support that we have been able to raise as a 28-year-old who's never held elective office is a pretty good sign that there is a base of support there for people who know me. And I hope to get to know more people and continue to build that. I actually argue that my experience, though, for this specific job is in a lot of ways more relevant than the experience of others. Not to say that they're unqualified or can't, do the job well, but Congress is just a totally different beast than a state legislature or a city council. A city council is, a relatively small number of people, 7 or 9, you can get to know them well. They're at least officially nonpartisan, and that can help to some degree. And legislatures are different because they have these session deadlines that force people to come to conclusions and keep moving forward. And again, on a relative size, they're pretty small in comparison. I mean, the House Democratic Caucus alone is larger than the entire membership of the state legislature. And so my point in all that is, as someone who's done communications back on Capitol Hill, is that in order to influence the debate, you do need to work your personal angles, and that's something that I've learned a lot from Denny about how to do that and how he's been able to have success. But you also need to be able to work a sort of bigger picture information angle in terms of shaping media coverage, understanding what's possible when certain moments arise and become political possibility. I would argue we have a lot of policy wonks back in DC, especially on the Democratic side. We do not have a lot of people who are operating at a very political, strategic level in terms of moving things forward. And I think in a lot of ways, that is the problem in trying to advance some of the causes that we've stalled on, is that we are still trying to be sort of cautious and think about the politics of the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And I think that having someone in there like me, who is really a political strategist at heart, but is able to actually have positional power and agenda setting power because I have an actual membership, is something that can make a big difference in terms of moving the ball forward. But again, in terms of the campaign support, I would just say that every day that goes by, we build more support. And again, I'm confident that we have a lane of people who are attracted to a message like ours, and I think we're going to be able to get that message out there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
In your response to the OI questionnaire regarding immigration, you said you wanted to remake CBP and ICE in a way that reflects our values. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of, there was a phase there where abolish ICE was sort of the go-to phrase. And I think that the sentiment behind that has been clearly established in terms of the cruel and inhumane policies that have been implemented by Stephen Miller, a white nationalist from the White House, but then implemented by ICE and CBP throughout our federal government. And so I don't have any particular affection for keeping ICE or CPB as agencies. They were created after 9/11 as the redo of the Department of Homeland Security. It's not like they're sort of old institutions with a storied history that we would be messing around with. But at the same time, I think just sort of saying, well, we're going to get rid of this agency and recreate it, that sort of misses the point, which is that we need to focus on the actions that they took and why those actions were so inhumane and wrong. The separation of children, the Remain in Mexico policy, the intentional separation of detained migrants from legal custody, which is something that we've seen more and more under the radar. So I think that what needs to happen is we need to go back to at least some of what was happening under the Obama administration in terms of so many of the people that are being detained, some of the immigrants are being detained. There's just no actual reason for them to be detained. It's simply being done because the Trump administration has quotas and they want to fill these private detention facilities. But I think in addition to that, we need to decouple our immigration enforcement from our law enforcement entirely. I mean, it's nonsensical to have ICE operating as sort of a detective force, or to force our local law enforcement agencies to do things that are really only being driven by a nativist agenda back in the White House, when our local law enforcement agencies, by and large, will tell you that they rely on those connections to local immigrant communities to help them do their job and keep our communities safe. So I think that one of the, I hope, positive outcomes that comes out of the disaster and cruelty that has been the Trump administration is a renewed understanding of what our immigration policy was doing to people, how it was treating people inhumanely, and recalibrating that into a future that treats everyone with basic human dignity and acknowledges that human beings can't be illegal, and that the circumstances that bring people here, especially when they are legally seeking asylum, are not things that we can just brush aside for political convenience. I'd also, on my Facebook page, I put out a video specifically about our immigration policy that I hope people go and watch if they want more info.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's for sure. There's been the inhumane policies are it's terrible. Okay, so let's let me ask you this question. This is a little longer question, but bear with me. It says, what is your opinion regarding the U.S. Navy using Washington state parks for electronic warfare training for Growler fighter jets? Is it necessary to install mobile signal transmitter trucks in Olympic National Forest and increase jet training flights over such portions as the whole rainforest and wilderness beaches? Does that activity justify the impact of increased noise pollution on residents, recreationists, and wildlife?
Yeah, so I've heard this question a few times. I think I know who asked it. And the dynamic here for folks who may have not known all the parts of this issue, the growlers, they fly out of a naval facility that isn't in the 10th Congressional District, and the national park is up in the 6th Congressional District on the Olympic Peninsula. And it's a federal thing, so that doesn't mean we're unconcerned about it, but I won't pretend to have an expertise in it because it's something that's outside of our district lines. Every time that I've brought this up within our office, that's been sort of the reaction that I've gotten, which is that, there were a lot of, I won't say tension, because I think it's been worked through over the last few years between Joint Base Lewis McChord and some of the surrounding communities. And this is a similar dynamic that other areas sort of near military facilities encounter. And so what I can promise to do is take a very serious look at it, learn more about it. I just honestly can't commit specifically because I do think that the Navy does need to do training flights, and I think maybe there is a way to do it outside of that national park. And if there is, then I think they should certainly do it. But it is an issue that I know primarily is involving the Olympic Peninsula. It's something that I think is a legitimate concern, but I'm not going to be able to commit one way or another until I can get there on the ground and talk more with the folks involved and talk with the Navy about what's going on there.
Okay. Okay. Let's go to housing. A lack of affordable housing is a big problem, not only here in Western Washington, but in many other states. What should the federal government do to help local communities like those in CD10 to get more affordable housing?
Yeah, great question. So housing is something that Danny has also worked a lot on in his role on the Financial Services Committee, which is the committee in charge of federal housing policy. And he's led a housing task force that I've helped collect information and publish our preliminary report on, identifying the nationwide problems in our housing shortage. The tricky thing about housing policy is that the policies that most directly affect it are set at the state and local level, and the federal government can't directly force people to change them. The markets also vary by region. But broadly speaking, there are just not enough housing units in America right now. We're actually reducing year over year the number of public housing units that are online because we are taking public housing units offline because they're becoming old and uninhabitable, and we're not building enough. So the federal government could start by actually continuing to produce public housing and keeping that housing number afloat and not making the problem worse. In terms of things that the feds can do to incentivize local governments to create housing rules and restrictions that promote growth, there are various forms of federal grants and financing opportunities, things like the Community Development Block Grant, which we can attach preconditions or incentives onto to encourage local and state governments to adopt policies that create more denser housing, housing that is more focused on transit-oriented development. It's the easiest way to solve this problem is to create more housing units. At the same time, growth without planning, growth without thought also has its own consequences, as we discovered in the 1990s here in the state when we passed the Growth Management Act. So I think what the federal government can best do, again, is invest in public housing, but then also in every opportunity that it can to influence the state and local government, nudge them, push them towards creating policies that have denser housing, more housing units, housing that is more thoughtful in terms of its connection to our transportation network, and housing that is also keeps in mind the long-term repercussions of old policies like redlining and racially discriminatory policies, which have done a lot of harm for Black and brown communities. Yes, in the South and in the Midwest and elsewhere, but here in Tacoma too. You can look at a map of Tacoma, mortgage lending practices from the 1960s, and then look at a map of Tacoma today. And the areas that were redlined back then are the historically Black neighborhoods here in Tacoma. This is not a sort of unique problem that's outside of the Pacific Northwest. It's something that people in the South Sound still deal with the consequences of every day. And on that specific point in terms of housing, the only way that we're going to be able to remedy that is with intentional investments to offset the intentional discrimination that's happened over the years. And that's going to involve, opportunities for folks who suffered during the subprime mortgage crisis to get back into the lending ability, target communities that were particularly hit during that time period, and just take any step that we can to try to remedy and ameliorate those years and years of discrimination. But I also, again, on my website, I have a pretty lengthy housing stance on there if people want to read more in detail about it.
Okay. Sorry, just a minute here.
Oh, no worries.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to the environment. Climate change mitigation is a top priority for Democrats. What strategies, legislation do you think would be most effective for reducing carbon emissions?
Yeah, so I think what we need to be thinking about, we're going to be passing climate-related legislation, carbon reduction, climate mitigation legislation for the rest of all of our lives. There's not going to be one big climate bill that then we're going to have solved this problem. It's going to require a lot of different things, and keeping it in mind as we go through any form of policy making, all of our appropriations bills, our defense bill, everything. And we also need to understand that it's a global problem. We do need to take national steps, but if we are not re-engaged in the Paris Climate Accord or the updated version of it to reflect the current science, we're never going to be able to solve this problem domestically. So that's the first thing that I would keep in mind, is that we need an executive branch that is going to also approach this with a global perspective. Within Congress, what we can do in terms of passing legislation, the piece that I think has the most political viability to it right now, and I think would be the biggest immediate impact, is probably something like, or specifically HR 763, which is the bill that the Citizens Climate Lobby has been promoting for several years now. It's a carbon tax and dividend scheme that would raise a fee on carbon pollution and then redistribute that as a dividend to lower income Americans. There's another version of that that would not be revenue neutral, that would use some of that money to make more progressive investments in infrastructure and stuff like that. I would be open to that if the votes are there. But I think what's really interesting about HR 763 is that there has been historically some willingness by moderate Republicans to support it. And while we can't wait on the Republicans to take action on this, anything that there's at least a modicum of possibility that we could sort of try to reset that framework and make them care about this, because eventually they are going to have to care about this. They're going to put it off as long as they possibly can, and then they're going to blame us when they have to do something about it. But eventually they're going to have to. And so I think that would be one good place to start, that we could take a big step. But again, there's going to be lots of other pieces of legislation that need to be taken in terms of mitigation, providing appropriations and funding to particularly impacted local governments who need those in terms of coastal and low-lying areas. And also thinking, again, through our flood control policies and other sort of disaster mitigation policies, we're going to have more hurricanes, we're going to have more extreme weather events. And if there are places that, every time there is a 100-year flood, that house floods, it may not make sense for the federal government to pay to replace that house every time. And those are going to be some tough decisions on the local level, but we've run out of time to solve the climate crisis. The time to take action was 10 years ago, and now we're faced with options that are less than ideal all around. But the time to act is now. The longer we wait, the worse the situation gets. And that's a case that I'm going to make back there. And actually, that's something that I'd like to dig in on a little bit, and sort of goes back to the original question about how I differ from Denny. I think a lot of policymaking, especially on the Democratic side over the last 50 years, has been really focused on the concept of incrementalism, which is that maybe we have a big vision of where we want to go, but if we're not able to make it, then we'll take a smaller step to get there. And I think on a lot of issues that has proven to be successful. I think on marijuana reform, cannabis reform, which is something that has started at the state level and is now taking small steps at the federal level in a way that the American public is going along with. But on climate, the whole theory sort of gets thrown out the door because the status quo is of itself the problem, right? The carbon that we are emitting today is the carbon that is going to be impacting us 10 years down the road. And so the longer we maintain the status quo, the worse the problem gets. And so the notion that we should be cautious because it would upset the apple cart and cause a backlash, again, it just doesn't hold up because the status quo is in and of itself a problem. And I think that's a point that is intellectually sound and that can break through back in DC, but I don't think it's being made yet. And I think that we need sort of a transition from folks who, there are a lot of members back there who advocate from sort of an outsider stance, and I think that's exactly what we need. But I think also the more sort of deliberative or insider-y, quote unquote, perspective in terms of good government working needs to acknowledge that climate change is a different issue than anything else that we face, and that further delay is just really not an option at this point.
Okay. Okay. Well, we talked about healthcare.
We can talk more about healthcare. It's important.
Yeah. Okay, here's another lengthier question, but one from one of our members, but here it goes. Okay, on the Olympia Tacoma Sunshine Movement questionnaire, you stated that you viewed yourself as a progressive, but that you had respect and working relationships with officials who might be classified as moderates. Mm-hmm. Question is, which officials, on which issues do you feel compatible negotiating away from a purely progressive stance?
Did they say negotiating away?
That's what the question is. I'm just reading the question that was.
Yeah. I was just trying to make sure I got the wording right. I guess I wouldn't really view it that way. I mean, when people ask me what my political views are, I say I am a liberal Democrat who holds progressive values. And when I say liberal Democrat, I do mean liberal in the sort of classical American sense, but I also mean liberal democracy. And we are in an ongoing war with authoritarian forces, both within our country and around the globe, who want to live in a world where a very tiny group of autocrats and oligarchs control things. And they've already taken over places like Russia. They're trying very hard to do it in places like the Philippines and Turkey and Brazil. And I think that ongoing struggle, which has really been exemplified in the Ukraine scandal, was probably the most prominent example that brought to the American public's attention. That is one of the defining issues of our time, and it is defining within the context of climate change as well. We are not going to solve the climate crisis if liberal democracy does not survive on this planet, and liberal democracy is not going to be able to survive in a planet that's been changed by climate. So that's my core sort of personal belief. And then in terms of progressive values, I think that we should use government to ameliorate human suffering, to bring justice into the world, to reduce discrimination, to end discrimination, to outlaw it, and give every person who's born into this world a good shot at a good life and an ability to lead one with happiness and not beholden to other forces in their lives, I guess would be a way to put it. So I know that doesn't quite adhere to a specific ideological, list of things, but that's where I come from. I was raised in a Unitarian Universalist household, if anybody here is familiar with them. I really believe in sort of an individual search for truth and meaning and holding on to our values. And so that's the perspective that I come from. In terms of what I was referencing in that question, it was Denny primarily, but also other figures like some of the ones that I've named. State Auditor Pat McCarthy and Mayor Woodard's up in Tacoma. And again, these are folks who I think broadly speaking, if I were in their shoes, I may have different policy stances. I may articulate things in different ways. But because I have spent the time, nearly 15 years now in these communities, getting to know them and building their trust, I witnessed this firsthand. There are things that if I go and tell them, they'll believe me and listen. But if an activist says it, they just won't hear it because of, that's with anybody. There are certain, biases that you have depending on the messenger within the message. And I think the point I'm trying to make there is that because of my background and because of where I was raised, I think I have an almost subversive ability in some ways to advance progressive causes and advance progressive values in spaces where they haven't typically been heard as much. And while, my work in Congressman Heck's office, first and foremost, is to support the member in their work, I think my colleagues there would tell you that I have tried to move that office and to be as progressive as we can, given the political realities, both internally and externally. And that is something that I would seek to do here as well, while keeping in mind, again, that this is a D+5 seat. It is teetering on the edge of being a swing district. And we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to listen to everybody in the district throughout it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you support public funds for charter schools?
No, I think that there is a good faith sense by a lot of folks who support charter schools that public education systems have let a lot of children down, especially in communities of color. But I think that the charter school experience that we've seen around the country and the sort of experimental version that we've started here in the state over the last few years, it's led to a lot of instability and uncertainty among the families who have gone there. I don't think there's much evidence that they've delivered a higher quality education. And I think the best thing that we should do is to have a robust, best in the nation public pre-K to 12 education system and also community college and such. So I don't think that charter schools are the solution. I think we need innovation and quality within our existing public system.
Okay, so we're coming on about we've had about 25 minutes or so of questions. I don't want to keep you. If I do have a few more questions, if you want, if you want a little bit longer.
I have a problem. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Do you consider, this is one that just came in the chat, do you consider yourself a strong progressive? How well do you think you could work with the Progressive Caucus in Congress, specifically the more assertive members, which includes AOC, Omar, Tlaib, etc.? How much voice do you wish to have for progressive causes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think a big reason why I'm running, and I've articulated this, I hope, is that I think that we need more people back there as messengers making that case for why these progressive values need to be advanced, not just for sort of an ideological reason because they're progressive and they should be advanced, but why those progressive values benefit everybody in the country, and why people who may only hear about progressives or Democrats from Fox News, if you can somehow break through that and talk about the actual consequences of what some of these progressive policies are able to deliver, can make a big difference. And I think that as a young person, and specifically mentioning some of those other members who are quite young, like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, we've seen that our national media, they enjoy the sort of narrative of seeing young people back there in public spaces. That's something we've seen not just with her, but with the Sunrise Movement, with March for Our Lives, with the climate strike. There is something about having young people in places of power that captures attention and can help shape that dialogue. And that is something that I would want to do. And I think that that is a way that I can complement some of what is being said by some of the vociferous progressives, vociferous maybe, strong progressives, whatever words you want to use, passionate. Again, just to go back to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, like, her district demographically is very different from this district. And I think she represents her district very, very well. But if she were, representing our district in the exact same way, or if the member from this district were representing her district in terms of, caring about, our military families and stuff, which there just is not a large presence there, not to say she doesn't care about military families, but there's a difference there's different flavors of progressive. And I think it's important to have all of those voices there and sort of a unified chorus to break through. And, one of the names there, I don't know if she's specifically named, but is within the SWAT, Ayanna Pressley. Ayanna Pressley, well, and some of the others, but Ayanna Pressley serves on financial services with Denny. And what he has found is that she was on the Boston Council. She has more experience in government than some of the other folks who have been in there. But she is as, I think, passionately progressive as anyone. but does take a sort of more measured approach in terms of her day-to-day sort of media and public engagements, and is very thoughtful and strategic about it. And I really view the work that she has done there over the last 2 years as something that I and lots of other people should model. I think she's been an ideal public servant for our generation, and I think we would be well served to have more people like her. So again, I consider myself a progressive. I would work in concert with the Progressive Caucus on all these issues that matter to us. But I do think that there is value in having multiple versions of progressive back there so that we can capture as many audiences as we can.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. And trying to understand your priorities, if you were allowed to pick the committees on which you will serve, what committees would you pick?
Yeah, so I would like to continue the work that Congressman Heck has been able to do on financial services, on housing, but also on other issues like Wall Street regulation. When the Wells Fargo scandal hit, that was something that they held that CEO before the committee, and I would argue that the reception that CEO got at that committee was almost the direct result of that was that he resigned a few days later. So there's an ability of that committee to really be an advocate for working people, for working families, and for anyone who's been harmed by our financial services system. So that's, and Denny is also the only member of Congress from the Pacific Northwest who is on the Financial Services Committee. So if he were to depart from it and not be replaced, that would be a big loss in terms of influence over a whole sector of the economy. I'd also be very interested in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think because Washington is really in a lot of ways a global state at the center of, obviously our Canadian friends to the north, but also immigrant communities from all over the world who come here to the Puget Sound to try to build a better life. And for so many of the issues that I'm really passionate about, and I think that really matter in the long term, again, liberal democracy, climate change, our COVID response, these are global issues that are going to require global cooperation. And I would want to be a part of those conversations and help move that dialogue forward and repair a lot of the damage that has been done under the current administration.
Okay. Who did you support during the Democratic presidential primary?
Yeah, so I ended up voting for Joe Biden because by that point, those were the only two options. And well, I guess it was him and Senator Sanders, though that was on the tail end of that. I voted for Vice President Biden because I think that he is the right person to build the broadest coalition to win in November. And I think that was evidenced by the higher turnout that we saw all over the South, all over the Midwest. And his ability to bring out people, at large turnout among the African-American community, but also people who I think for any other Democrat in that field, they just maybe wouldn't have been able to support. That doesn't mean I have any disrespect for Senator Sanders. I think he's done an incredible thing over the last 5 years and has will forever shape the nature of the Democratic Party. But I think that in this moment, at this time, I thought Vice President Biden was the right person to lead the party. I also will say, and maybe this is what the question was getting at early on, but as a young gay man involved in politics, seeing Mayor Pete on that debate stage and seeing his presence in that race had a huge impact on me, sort of personally and emotionally. And I think this phrase "representation matters" is something that sort of gets thrown around as sort of a cliche, but it truly does. And I know that there were policy stances that Mayor Pete took that I'm sure people on this call maybe don't agree with. There are some that I don't agree with. I don't agree with his Medicare for All stance. But if he hadn't run, then we would still be living in a country where there was never a major party presidential candidate who was LGBTQ. And I think that was a very powerful and positive step forward for our country, regardless of sort of specific policy differences with him. I was sort of enthusiastic about him for those reasons. But broadly speaking, I think that now, my campaign manager came out of the Elizabeth Warren policy shop. I have a finance director who worked for Michael Bennett. You really could not find two campaigns that were on different ends of the spectrum than that. But I think at this point, we need to unify, we need to advance our progressive values, and we need to defeat Donald Trump.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. We definitely need to unify.
Yeah.
Beat Trump. So I think comes to the end of the questions. would you like to take a few minutes just to wrap up and tell us how to, we can, well, your website and
Yeah.
what we can do if we want to help?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll thank you again for your time. And I will be brief. I think that what this election is going to come down to, there were 19 candidates who filed, and 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, 3 independents. And just the way the vote split, it's pretty likely that we're going to have 2 Democrats advance the general election. And that's an exciting thing. And that's a good thing, I think. I think that it would be a real shame if in that election there were candidates who frankly don't really represent the district, who don't live here. I think that I am the Pierce County Democrat who really represents the Pierce County portion of this district. I think a general election between myself and Representative Dolio, who's someone who I have deep respect for, would be a really good discourse on progressive values within the 10th. And I think that would be the ideal outcome for sort of every progressive here in the South Sound. Again, I'm not in this race to run against any of these folks. It's an open seat, so I will simply say why I think I am the best person for this fit. I think I have the most relevant experience. I think I have the deepest familiarity with this district. I think I have the political sense to be able to hold on to it in good and bad years. And I think our district has a real opportunity here to make a statement to the nation that we need young people with experience and know-how and a record of service, not just serving as staffers, but in real positions of authority back there, helping set the agenda and move the ball forward. And all my life, I've heard people of all different ages tell us that young people need to step up and get involved. I believe that. I'm here doing that. And I know you can only vote for one person ultimately, and that makes it really tough. But I think that this is a moment in all of our lives where we can really do something historic and different here at a time when our country really needs it. And I would take the responsibility of representing you in Congress with all the seriousness that I have put into my current 10 years of service with Congressman Heck. I will always fight for you. I will always fight for your family. I will always fight for your future. And I will never be afraid to speak truth to power. And again, I appreciate your time today. I appreciate the opportunity to have worked with you over the last 3 years. And I'd be honored to earn your vote. And I am at philgardner.com. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Phil. You've been, really, it's been really extraordinary listening to you. You seem like you've got an encyclopedic knowledge of everything going on in Congress. And that's really cool. And I want to, again, thank you for your partnership with OI and letting us being a part of, what you and Denny have been doing in Congress. So thank you for that again, too.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. I think that really kind of wraps it up. So we'll see how it goes. And
Yeah.
good luck to you.
Great. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.